The lake was silent that morning, the kind of silence that sits on your shoulders and makes you forget the rest of the world exists. Mist floated low over the water, drifting like ghosts between the reeds. Walter stood ankle-deep in the shallows, the cold biting through his boots as he cast his line for the third time. He wasn't there for the fish, not really. He hadn't kept a catch in years. This place was a habit now, like coffee for some, or prayer for others. Out here, there was no noise, no questions, just the soft slosh of water and the occasional rustle of wind through pine. Then he heard it, a soft splash. Too light for a fish, too close for comfort. Walter turned slowly, instinctively careful not to make a sound. Just 10 feet away, standing still in the water like some vision from a dream, was a small bobcat. Its fur was soaked to the skin, legs trembling, ribs showing beneath the matted coat. It wasn't snarling. It wasn't afraid. It just stared at him, wide amber eyes locked with his. He froze, not from fear, but from the strange calm that settled over the moment. The bobcat didn't move, didn't flinch. It looked desperate, but not dangerous. And then it did something he would never forget. It stepped closer. The ripples fanned out around its tiny legs as it moved through the water, head low, but eyes never leaving his. Walter's fingers gripped the handle of his fishing rod a little tighter, more out of confusion than threat. The animal stopped just a few feet away, too close for a wildcat, too close for comfort. And then, without a sound, it sat down, right there in the shallow water, watching him, waiting. Walter blinked. Once, twice, but it was still there, real as the pole in his hand. 100 thoughts ran through his mind, rabies, starvation, confusion, but none of them matched what he saw in the animal's face. It wasn't mad or sick. It was asking, pleading. Walter slowly reached into his bait bucket and pulled out a small trout. He held it up, showed it to the bobcat, and then tossed it gently toward the animal, letting it land just short of where the water deepened. The fish landed with a soft plop, and for the first time, the bobcat moved quickly. It sniffed the offering, picked it up in its mouth, and turned. But it didn't run. It paused, looked back. Its eyes met Walter's again for just a second, and then it padded quietly through the reeds and disappeared into the trees. Walter stood motionless, heart ticking louder than his thoughts. What just happened? Was it real? He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. But the bobcat didn't return. The spell was broken. The forest back to its usual hush. Still, something inside him shifted. That look, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't just hunger. That animal had come for a reason. The next morning, Walter went back to the same spot. Same time, same fog hugging the water like a blanket. And there it was again. The bobcat stood in almost the same place, as if waiting for him. It didn't come as close this time. It didn't sit, but it didn't run either. Just stared again with those same eyes. Walter reached into his bait bucket and offered another fish. This time, the bobcat didn't take it right away. It stood there, gaze fixed, and then slowly turned and walked back into the woods, leaving the fish untouched. Walter waited a while, but the animal didn't return. On the third morning, the routine repeated. But this time, when the bobcat appeared, it walked out of the trees with strange urgency. It didn't stop at the water's edge. It came right up to the same shallow place and stood there, dripping wet, staring. Walter felt his breath catching his chest. He dropped his rod and stepped forward. The bobcat turned and began walking away again, but slower this time. Then it stopped, looked back, waited, and that was the moment Walter understood. It didn't want food. It wanted him to follow. With a knot forming in his throat, Walter stepped out of the water and into the forest, letting the trees close behind him. The bobcat moved ahead, quiet and purposeful, not scared, not rushing, just leading. Walter followed. The forest grew denser as they moved. Branches scratched at his arms, and muddy roots pulled at his boots. The bobcat would move ahead, then pause, making sure he was still behind. It wasn't random. It wasn't wild. It was the path, a message. And Walter couldn't explain why, but he trusted it. Something out here was waiting. Something this little creature couldn't face alone. And somehow it had chosen him. The deeper Walter followed the bobcat into the woods, the more the world changed. The familiar hum of the lake faded behind him, replaced by the layered hush of the forest. Chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Sunlight filtered to the high canopy in golden beams, catching dust in the air like tiny spirits dancing between trees. The ground beneath his boots shifted from damp soil to moss-covered earth, soft and springy. With each step, the sense of ordinary slipped further away. The bobcat led with quiet purpose, pausing every so often to glance back, ensuring Walter hadn't fallen too far behind. It moved gracefully, weaving between tree trunks and ducking under low-hanging limbs. Walter kept pace the best he could, though his knees complained with every incline and his breath came heavier the farther they went. He wasn't built for hikes like this anymore. Not since his back surgery, not since the years had settled into his bones. But something about the way the bobcat looked at him, steady, expectant, urged him on. After what felt like 30 minutes, the woods opened slightly into a small clearing. A circle of light spilled onto the forest floor where ferns had grown thick and wildflowers bobbed gently in the breeze. The bobcat stopped there, not at random. It stood at the edge of a fallen log, its ears perked and nose twitching. Walter stepped into the clearing, heart pounding not from the walk, but from the quiet tension that seemed to hover in the air. The bobcat crouched low, not in fear, but in something that felt like reverence. It crept forward toward the log and sniffed, then looked back at Walter with a new kind of urgency in its eyes. He took a slow step forward, unsure of what he'd find. Then he heard it, a faint sound, so soft he wasn't sure if it was real. A small, high-pitched whimper, muffled by brush and bark. He froze and tilted his head, listening. There it was again. Walter knelt down, ignoring the sharp tug in his knees. He gently pushed aside some tangled vines near the base of the log, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath the wood. Inside, curled up tightly in a hollow, was another bobcat, much smaller, barely moving. Its sides rose and fell in shallow breaths, and one of its front legs looked twisted at an odd angle. Its eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy and unfocused, before closing again. Walter felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't just a second cub. It was hurt, weak, probably starving. The first bobcat, the one who had led him, sat nearby, watching silently. It didn't move to nudge its sibling, didn't try to pull it out. It just waited, eyes never leaving Walter. "You brought me here for this," he whispered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. And in a strange way, he understood. It wasn't about trust. It wasn't about food. It was about survival. And this little wild creature had made a choice. It had asked a human for help. He sat back on his heels, thoughts racing. They were too deep in the woods to carry the injured cub out with bare hands. He had no tools, no first aid supplies. And worst of all, it was getting late. The soft light now slanting through the trees had taken on an orange hue. Evening was coming. Walter stood and looked around the clearing. The terrain wasn't steep, but it was rough. He'd have to come back tomorrow. Bring something to carry the cub, something to keep it warm. Still, something felt incomplete. He glanced at the healthy bobcat. It still hadn't moved. "You coming with me?" he asked softly, knowing how ridiculous it sounded. But the words left his mouth anyway. He turned to go, expecting the animal to vanish again into the trees like before. But it didn't. It stood up and followed him. Walter walked slower this time, not out of fatigue, but reflection. Every crunch of a twig beneath his boots felt heavier now, more significant. A story was unfolding, one he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. By the time he reached the edge of the woods and stepped back into the clearing near the lake, the sun had slipped low behind the hills. Shadows stretched long over the water, and the breeze had picked up, carrying a damp chill with it. Walter turned back one last time. The bobcat had stopped at the tree line. It stood still, silhouetted by the fading light, watching him go. He raised a hand, not a wave, exactly, just a quiet gesture. The animal blinked once, slowly, then melted back into the trees. That night, Walter barely slept. His mind kept circling the image of that tiny body beneath the log, the way its breathing had barely lifted its chest. And the older cub, its calm, its focus, the trust in its eyes. By morning, he had a plan. He loaded a soft old blanket into a canvas fishing sack and took a length of rope just in case. A cooler filled with 2 fresh fish rested at his feet. Not for bait, for them. Walter stepped into the cold morning air and headed toward the lake again, eyes scanning the shore. But the bobcat wasn't there. Still, he didn't hesitate. He walked into the woods alone, retracing his steps from memory. It was strange. What had seemed like a confusing tangle of forest a day before now felt like a path, as if the animal had left something behind in the air itself, guiding him. He followed it, not with fear, not with doubt, just something close to faith. When he reached the clearing, the scene was unchanged. The log, the hush, the stillness of nature holding its breath. And there they were, the healthy cub crouched beside its sibling, curled protectively around it, tail wrapped close. It looked up when Walter appeared, but it didn't run. It simply waited. He knelt again and placed the blanket beside the log. Gently, slowly, he reached inside. The injured cub stirred faintly but didn't resist. Walter bundled it in the soft fabric, mindful of the twisted leg, and eased it into the sack. The healthy bobcat stepped forward, not to stop him, just to see. Walter held out one of the fish from the cooler and placed it on the moss. The bobcat sniffed it, but didn't eat. Instead, it looked back at its sibling. Then, without a sound, it followed Walter again, and together they left the forest behind. Walter didn't speak as he moved. Not that there was anyone to hear him. The trail back to his truck was uneven and winding, and every step sent a quiet jolt up through his knees. But he didn't complain. The bundled cub in his fishing sack pressed against his side, its fragile body radiating a faint, desperate warmth through the blanket. Every so often, he glanced down to check if it was still breathing. So far, it was behind him. He could hear the soft, measured steps of the healthy cub trailing just out of reach, just beyond arm's length. It moved like a shadow, like quick, always watching but never intruding. It was strange, having a wild animal walking with him like this. Not fleeing, not stalking, just accompanying, like it knew he was doing his best. When Walter reached the edge of the woods, the late morning sun had broken through the clouds, warming the lakeside with soft gold. The reflections danced on the water's surface, but he barely noticed. His mind was fixed on one thing, getting the injured cub to someone who could actually help. He eased a bundle into the passenger seat of his old truck, placing a folded jacket beneath it for padding. The cub let out a low, almost inaudible sound, half a sigh, half a whimper, but it didn't struggle. Walter took one last glance toward the trees. The second cub had stopped at the forest edge again, sitting in the shade just before the light touched the grass. Walter didn't wave this time. He simply nodded once, slowly, and got into the driver's seat. The drive into town was long and bumpy, the kind of drive that made every loose bolt in the truck rattle like a jar of coins. Walter kept one hand on the steering wheel, and the other resting lightly on the sack, steadying it, whispering under his breath without realizing it. "You're all right, kid. Hang in there. Just a bit further." He pulled into the gravel lot behind the local wildlife rescue center just after noon. The building was small, almost camouflaged by the trees around it, but clean and well-kept. A woman in her 40s wearing a vest with the sanctuary's logo stepped outside as he parked. Walter stepped out with the sack in his arms and walked straight toward her. "I found this," he said quietly. "Needs help." The woman's eyes widened as she gently pulled back the blanket. "Oh, my," she murmured. "That's a bobcat cub. There's another one. Healthy. out in the woods still. She nodded quickly and gestured for him to follow. Inside, the building was cool and smelled faintly of pine and antiseptic. They moved to a quiet back room where she laid the cub gently on a padded table. 2 other staff joined them, moving with the quiet focus of people who knew this kind of work too well. Walter stood back, his hands empty now, but still curled like he was holding something. The woman turned to him after a few moments. "She's female," she said softly. "Dehydrated, malnourished. That leg might be broken, but it's not infected. She's tough. She held on longer than most would have." Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Will she make it?" he asked. The woman looked at the cub, then back at him. "If she made it this far, with someone watching over her, I'd say yes." He nodded slowly. "There's more," he said after a pause. "The other one, the healthy one, led me to her, brought me to the hollow where she was hiding. It waited for me 3 mornings in a row. It wanted help." The woman raised her eyebrows, impressed. "That's rare. They're usually so skittish. That kind of behavior, that's not just instinct. That's something else." Walter didn't answer. He just watched the little cub breathe. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the soft hum of medical machines and the murmur of voices outside. Then he asked, almost hesitantly, "Can I visit her?" The woman gave a kind smile. "Of course. She already knows your scent. It might help her stay calm." Walter returned to the center the next day, and the next, and the next after that. He didn't bring flowers or balloons. He brought silence, a kind of still presence that seemed to reassure the cub more than anything else could. He sat on a wooden stool in the observation room and watched as the little Bobcat, now called Maple by the staff, slowly gained strength. She was still small, still healing, but her eyes were brighter now. She responded to movement. She even tried to bat at a piece of string one of the volunteers dangled from a rod. Each day, the bond between them grew stronger, not through touch or words, but through shared space, a steady rhythm. The same time, the same chair, the same quiet old man sitting with her as the sun moved slowly across the wall. And then one morning, something changed. Walter arrived as usual, nodding to the receptionist and heading to the back room. When he stepped into the observation area, he stopped short. The healthy cub was there, in a large enclosure next to Maple's. Walter blinked. The staff member nearby noticed his surprise. "We trapped her yesterday," she explained gently. "She was circling the woods near the center. Didn't run. Just sat and watched us. So we brought her in. Turns out she's her sister." Walter stepped closer to the glass, heart thudding. The second cub was pacing slowly, eyes alert but calm. She stopped when she saw him. Her ears twitched forward. She walked up to the glass. Walter leaned forward, not touching it, just looking. The cub stared up at him, and for a moment they were back at the lake, standing in the shallows, locked in silent understanding. The staff member's voice softened. "We think she came to check on Maple. She stayed nearby, waiting. It's rare. But then again, this whole thing is rare." Walter smiled faintly, eyes never leaving the Bobcats. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't need words to know when something's been entrusted to you." The cub blinked slowly. Calm, steady. She wasn't just watching him anymore. She was remembering. The next few days settled into an almost sacred routine. Every morning, Walter arrived at the sanctuary before the sun had fully climbed over the treetops. He'd bring a thermos of black coffee and sit quietly in the corner of the observation room, where the Bobcat sisters were kept in side-by-side enclosures. Maple, the injured one, was healing faster than anyone expected. She was gaining weight, moving more confidently on her wrapped leg, even beginning to show flickers of playfulness. But it was the older sister, now nicknamed Ash by the staff, who held Walter's attention the most. She never warmed to anyone else, no matter how kind or gentle they were. She barely tolerated the vet techs during feedings and checkups. But when Walter was in the room, her whole posture changed. She'd sit near the edge of the enclosure, eyes calm, occasionally resting her chin against the glass. She didn't need to be near him, but she chose to be. Some of the younger volunteers began calling it the bond. Whispers passed between staff, half in awe, half in wonder. A wild bobcat showing devotion to an old man, not because she was tamed, but because she had chosen him. It was beautiful, but the stillness couldn't last forever. Late one afternoon, Walter arrived to find the sanctuary unusually tense. A rescue truck was parked out front, doors still open, and 2 rangers were unloading crates and equipment in a rush. Inside, a worried-looking staffer met him at the door. "There's been a disturbance," she said in a hushed voice. One of the rangers was out doing trail checks near the South Ridge, found a snare, an illegal one. Walter's stomach tightened. "Someone trapping?" She nodded grimly. "We think it's poachers. And based on the tracks, it looks like a large animal may have been caught recently and pulled free. There was blood on the ground. They're trying to see if it was just a deer or—" Her voice trailed off, but Walter knew where her thought was headed. The forest where maple and ash had been found wasn't just wild. It was vulnerable. Hunters, trappers, and outsiders sometimes came in during off-seasons. Illegal activity was rare, but not unheard of. What if it was their mother? Walter asked quietly. The staffer hesitated. "We don't know. Could be. There were signs, scratch marks, for caught in the wire, but we don't know how old." Walter stood in silence. He stared out the window toward the woods beyond the sanctuary. He'd seen the mother bobcat only once. But he hadn't forgotten her, injured, fierce, dragging herself forward just to be near her cubs before collapsing. And he'd left her there, alone. The thought sank into his chest like a stone. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the wind scratched at the windows. The image of that dark snare looped over and over in his mind. If someone was setting traps again, it wasn't just the bobcats at risk. It was everything out there, everything that still belonged to the wild. By dawn, he was back in the woods. He didn't tell the sanctuary staff. He didn't need permission to walk the trails he knew better than most. With a sturdy stick in one hand and a flashlight in the other, he followed the familiar path toward the old hollow where he'd first found maple. The forest had changed since then. The leaves were thicker. The air was hotter. But the memories clung to the roots and rocks like moss. For hours he walked, eyes sharp, ears tuned, and then he found it, a trail of broken brush. Something had struggled here, recently. Branches snapped, blood smeared on bark, fur caught in thorns. Walter crouched low, inspecting the tracks. They were too large to be deer, and too clean to be accidental. This was no random injury. Something had escaped a trap and kept moving. He followed the trail deeper into the trees, past the ravine, past a fallen log, until the forest thickened and the ground grew uneven. Then he saw it, a second snare, crude, rusted, coiled like a serpent and hidden beneath a dusting of leaves. Walter's breath caught in his throat. It hadn't been used yet, but it was set. He knelt and disabled it, carefully folding the wire and burying it under a large stone. Whoever placed it had done so with intention. This wasn't random hunting. It was targeting. Walter stood, heart pounding. He turned the head back and froze. Behind him, on a high ridge, stood a figure. Human, watching. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But even from a distance, Walter could feel the tension coil between them like a drawn bow. The figure turned and disappeared into the trees. Walter waited until he was sure the person was gone before moving again. His hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. What kind of person set traps in a place like this? What kind of soul tried to catch something so defenseless? By the time he returned to the sanctuary, his clothes were soaked with sweat, and his mind was already racing. He pulled one of the staffers aside. "There's someone out there," he said firmly, still setting snares. They nodded. "We're reporting it to the rangers, but until they can patrol it fully, Walter didn't wait for the rest. That evening, he sat by the enclosures, quieter than usual. Maple was resting. Ash was watching him. He leaned forward, eyes meeting hers through the glass. "You led me once," he said quietly, "and I think I need to do the same for you." It was a promise, spoken into the hush between species, a thread connecting them. And the next day, that promise would be tested in a way he never expected. The sky was still pale when Walter arrived at the sanctuary the next morning, the sun barely pushing its way over the treetops. A soft mist hovered in the low grass, clinging to the air like a memory, refusing to fade. He walked with purpose this time. No fishing rod, no bait bucket. Just a pack slung over his shoulder, its contents carefully chosen. Rope, a flashlight, a folded tarp, and a heavy, unwavering resolve. Inside, the staff were already moving, preparing for the day. A volunteer offered him coffee, but he shook his head. His eyes drifted instinctively toward the observation room, where Maple slept curled in a tight ball of fur and healing. Ash, in the adjacent enclosure, was already awake, alert, standing near the glass. She knew. Walter stepped up to the edge and crouched. They looked at each other for a long moment. No movement, no sound. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the dull metal clasp of the snare he disarmed the day before. He held it up where Ash could see it. Her eyes locked onto it. Her body tensed, muscles rippling beneath her fur. Walter nodded once. "I need to go back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this time I won't be alone." The staff had arranged for a ranger to meet Walter later in the day, but he couldn't wait. The more he thought about the snare, about the man on the ridge, the more certain he became. If someone was still out there, they weren't just after game. They were hunting with knowledge, targeting a place where the animals had once felt safe. By mid-morning, he was back in the woods. Every sound now seemed sharper. Every twig snap, every bird call, every rustle in the underbrush set his nerves on edge. But he pushed forward, following the same winding trail as before. This time, he veered slightly north, toward a ridge that overlooked the hollow. And that's when he heard it. A yelp, short, strained, and unmistakably feline. Walter froze, heart jumping into his throat. He moved toward the sound, pushing through low branches and tangled brush. The cry came again, fainter now, weaker, urgent. He crested a rise and looked down into a small gully, and what he saw stopped him cold. A bobcat, not Maple, not Ash, an adult, fur-matted with blood, one leg caught tightly in the sharp coil of a rusted snare. She was trying to drag herself free, but every movement sent new jolts of pain through her. Her eyes flicked up as Walter approached, wide with panic and instinct. It was her, the mother. Walter didn't speak. He knelt slowly, showing his hands. Every inch mattered. Every breath had weight. The bobcat bared her teeth weakly, more in pain than in threat. He didn't flinch. With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled the tarp from his bag and laid it out beside her. She hissed but didn't strike. Walter studied the snare, old, cruel, and dug deep into her flesh. He reached for the rope, looping it into a snare of his own, one meant for safety, not harm. He wrapped it gently around her midsection, not to restrain but to steady. Then, carefully, breath held, he began loosening the trap. She growled, bucked once, but he held firm, whispering softly under his breath. Words meant more for himself than for her. "You're all right now. I've got you." The metal gave way with a final, awful creak. Blood seeped from the wound, but she didn't pull away. She just lay there, trembling, chest heaving. Walter worked fast. He slid the tarp beneath her and rolled her gently to the center, tying the edges into a crude sling. He lifted with all the strength his old body could summon, the weight awkward but manageable. He staggered back up the ridge, sweat dripping down his neck, arms shaking. Every few steps, he had to pause, breathing hard, listening for sounds in the woods, sounds of movement or worse, pursuit. But the forest held its breath. By the time he reached the clearing near the lake, his legs were buckling. He laid the tarp down and rested beside her, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The bobcat opened her eyes again. Not angry, not afraid, just tired. She didn't move when he brushed her shoulder with the back of his hand. "You stayed alive," he murmured. "For them. You held on." In the distance, an engine rumbled softly. The ranger had arrived. They loaded the mother carefully into a transport crate, the vet already prepping supplies. Walter watched from the side, covered in sweat, clothes torn from brambles, but his eyes never left her. "She'll need surgery," the vet said gently, "but you found her just in time." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "She's tough," he said. "Her cubs are the reason she made it." The ranger glanced at him. "You said there were others?" Walter exhaled. "2 cubs. I found them last week. They're safe now. At the sanctuary." The ranger smiled. "Then she's got a reason to fight." Back at the rescue center, the staff scrambled to prepare for the mother's arrival. Maple was moved to a quieter space. Ash, when she saw the crate being brought in, stood on her hind legs at the edge of her enclosure, watching with electric stillness. And then something happened no one expected. As the crate was wheeled past, the mother, weak, drugged, stitched and bandaged, lifted her head, just barely. Her eyes searched, and stopped on Ash. The cub responded instantly, ears forward, tail twitching, body pressed against the glass. She let out a low, soft sound, almost like a cry. It wasn't a reunion. It was a recognition. Even in pain, even half sedated, the mother remembered. And in that moment, something invisible yet undeniable passed between them. A thread of family, of survival, of love carried not in words but in blood and instinct. Walter stood in the doorway, watching all unfold. He had followed a wild creature into the woods, thinking he was answering a plea. But what he found was more than need. It was trust. It was a family refusing to give up, a mother fighting through pain, a cub refusing to leave her sister behind, and a man, tired, grieving, lonely, who had found something worth standing for again, not because he was strong, but because something wild had seen something gentle in him and called him forward. The sun was setting behind the tree line when Walter returned to the sanctuary one last time that week. The sky blazed with streaks of orange and gold, casting long shadows across the gravel path and turning the tops of the pines into silhouettes. He moved slowly, his steps steady but unhurried, as if every moment deserved to last just a little longer. The pain in his back had grown sharper since that trek through the forest, but he didn't mind it now. It was the kind of ache that reminded him he'd done something that mattered. Inside, the sanctuary was quiet, quieter than usual. Maple and Ash had been moved to a larger shared enclosure with soft earth beneath their paws and branches to climb. The mother was still in recovery but improving each day, her strength returning slowly, her gaze more alert with each visit. She was no longer sedated, no longer broken. She was watching, waiting, rebuilding her place in the world, one breath at a time. Walter walked to the observation window and leaned on the wooden rail, eyes scanning the enclosure. Ash was perched high on a branch, her body relaxed but attentive. Maple was curled at the base of the trunk, one paw tucked under her chest. And the mother, she lay nearby, her eyes following Walter's movement as he stepped into view. She didn't growl. She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, a long, unblinking look that felt like both a thank you and a farewell. She hadn't forgotten. Neither had he. A soft knock came at the glass behind him. One of the staff, Sarah, the woman who had first taken Maple in, smiled and opened the door a crack. "She's healing well," she said. "We think they'll be ready for release by the end of the month." All 3 of them. Walter nodded slowly. The idea of letting them go filled him with a strange, bittersweet calm. It was what he'd hoped for all along, but also, selfishly, what he now dreaded. He had grown used to them, to this rhythm, to being needed. Still, he knew that freedom wasn't just what they deserved. It was what they were made for. The following week passed like the final pages of a story already told. The sanctuary arranged for a remote release site, a protected area near the same lake where it all began, far from roads, free from traps, a place untouched. Walter asked to be there. They agreed. On the day of the release, a small group gathered quietly by the edge of the woods. Rangers stood nearby. Sanctuary staff waited beside the transport cages, their voices low, their movements gentle. The air was cool and still. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. Walter stood apart from the group, near the trail where the Bobcat had first emerged from the mist that morning by the lake. He could still remember every second. How she had looked at him, how she had trusted him, how she had turned back not to run, but to lead. The cages were open one by one. Ash was the first to step out. She didn't bolt. She paused, sniffed the air, then walked forward slowly, tail high, disappearing into the brush. Maple came next, limping slightly but strong. She turned her head, looked back at the people behind her just once, then followed her sister into the trees. Then came the mother. She emerged slowly, gracefully, her movements fluid despite the weeks of recovery. She stepped out of the crate and stood tall, her body casting a long shadow across the clearing. She turned her head, and then, just for a moment, her eyes locked on Walter's. He held his breath, and she blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Then she turned and walked into the forest after her daughters. And just like that, they were gone. The trees closed behind them. The wind rustled the leaves. And the world went quiet again. Walter stood there for a long while after the others had left, staring into the woods. The ache in his bones felt heavier today. The silence stretched. But inside that silence was peace. He had come to the lake each morning to be alone, to escape the noise of a world that had moved on, to disappear quietly without making ripples. But instead, something found him, something wild, something silent and vulnerable and brave, a creature that had crossed the invisible boundary between the natural world and the human one, not out of fear or instinct, but out of hope. And because of that, his life would never be the same. He turned slowly and walked back to his truck. The birds were singing now, faint and melodic in the distance. The air smelled of pine and earth and something else, something clean, something free. As he started the engine, his eyes drifted once more to the trailhead. He knew he might never see them again, but that was the way it should be. Some bonds aren't meant to be caged. Some gifts are meant to be given back. And sometimes, the greatest act of love isn't saving something. It's letting it go. When the wild places whisper, it's not always for rescue. It's for connection. And if you listen closely, they might just lead you not to what you're saving, but to what will save you.